I remember the exact moment I should have walked away. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was sitting across from a man whose name I've genuinely forgotten. That's not a metaphor. I've tried to recall it multiple times over the past 2 years, and it simply doesn't stick. But his demeanor, that I remember clearly. The office building wasn't impressive. It was one of those anonymous structures you see on industrial roads, the kind you pass 100 times without ever really noticing. Steel and glass, mostly empty parking lot. A single security guard at the front desk who barely looked up when I arrived. I'd sent my resume through a job board website weeks earlier, applied to something vaguely titled Facility Monitoring Specialist, largely forgotten about it. When they called back, the recruiter's voice was professional, but oddly careful, as if each word had been chosen from a limited set of approved phrases. The interview room itself was aggressively neutral. White walls, a table, 3 chairs, fluorescent lighting that hummed just barely at the edge of perception. The man across from me asked me standard questions at first. Background, experience, why I was interested in the position. I answered honestly. I needed work. The salary listed was genuinely good, and I wasn't in a position to be selective. With student loans and rent in the current market, you take what's offered. He seemed to appreciate my directness, but when I asked him what the job actually entailed, something shifted. He paused, not awkwardly, more like he was consulting an internal list of what he was permitted to say. Then he told me it involved monitoring and documentation, the work that was confidential in nature. I would need to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. He used the phrase "for security reasons" twice in quick succession. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed for specifics. I should have demanded clarity on what I'd actually be doing. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. The vagueness somehow made the job feel more prestigious, more important. If they couldn't tell me details, it meant there were details worth keeping secret. The implication flattered me. I imagined myself in some role that mattered, work that required discretion. He slid a folder across the table. Not a job description, really, more like a collection of expectations. Physical security, no personal electronics in certain areas, no discussions about work outside the facility. And then, toward the bottom, a section titled Initial Protocol Briefing. It contained exactly 3 sentences. You will be provided with facility rules upon arrival. These rules are non-negotiable. Your compliance with all established protocols is a condition of employment. I remember thinking how formal it all sounded, how serious. At the time, I interpreted it as the mark of a legitimate operation, something run with real institutional weight. Now I understand it was a warning I chose not to hear. The interview ended quickly after that. He stood, extended his hand, and told me I'd be a good fit. He didn't smile, but he nodded in a way that felt conclusive. As I left the building, walking back to my car through that mostly empty parking lot, I felt genuinely fortunate. I'd landed something serious, something that, in retrospect, I was actively hunting for someone exactly like me, someone desperate enough not to ask the right questions, qualified enough to be useful, isolated enough that disappearance wouldn't immediately raise alarms. That's what I didn't understand then. The interview wasn't an assessment of my skills. It was an assessment of my vulnerability. The facility was 45 minutes outside the city, nestled in a landscape that seemed deliberately chosen for its emptiness. Flat terrain, sparse trees, the kind of place where you could scream and only the highway noise would answer back. The building itself was larger than I'd expected, a sprawling complex of connected structures, all of them the same institutional beige, all of them marked with numbers instead of names. I arrived at 7 in the morning on a Monday. My contact from the interview had sent me an email with directions and a start time. Nothing else, just coordinates and a time. The parking lot had maybe 20 cars scattered across its vastness. It was early April, and there was still a chill in the air that made me pull my jacket tight as I walked toward the main entrance. The building hummed, literally hummed, a low electrical vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I would later learn this was the ventilation system, complex and multi-layered, designed to maintain specific atmospheric conditions throughout different sections. At the time, I just found it unsettling. A woman at the front desk, she had a name tag that read "Security, nothing more," scanned my ID and handed me a visitor's badge. She didn't make eye contact. I've thought about that moment many times since. She knew something. The way she handed me that badge felt like she was passing me a liability. My orientation guide was a man named Derek. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with the kind of posture that suggested years of standing in uncomfortable situations. He greeted me with efficiency, but not warmth, as if warmth would have required an investment he wasn't willing to make. He led me through a series of hallways, each one more identical than the last, all of them humming with that same electrical undertone. Derek explained the basics quickly: security protocols, bathroom locations, where to store personal items, and yes, I had to store them, not carry them. No phones past the security checkpoint, no cameras, no recording devices of any kind. The facility operated on a strict compartmentalization system, he said. Different sections required different access levels. I would learn more as I progressed. As we walked, I began to notice things. The hallways seemed longer than the building's exterior suggested they should be. When we'd pass intersections, Derek would always take me the long way, steering us away from certain corridors with a casualness that somehow made the avoidance more obvious. He never explicitly said I couldn't go down those paths, but the implication was clear enough. We passed a door marked "Monitoring Station, Authorized Personnel Only." Derek slowed as we passed it, almost as if he wanted me to see it, but he didn't stop. I asked him what was inside. "That's where you'll be working," he said. "You'll get a full briefing tomorrow." Then he kept walking, moving us away from that section with deliberate speed. The break room was smaller than I'd expected. A refrigerator that sounded like it was dying, a microwave, a table with 4 chairs. 3 of the chairs were occupied. Derek introduced me to the others: Maria, who worked evening shifts; Tom, who was leaving soon and didn't seem particularly interested in meeting me; and James, older, maybe in his 60s, with eyes that had seen enough to know better than to ask questions. They greeted me with the kind of polite distance that suggested camaraderie was a resource carefully rationed. Derek left me with them and told me to wait there. "Someone will come get you for the rules briefing," he said, "probably in an hour." I sat at the table with these 3 strangers. None of them seemed inclined to speak. The refrigerator hummed. The fluorescent lights hummed. Even the silence seemed to hum, if that makes sense. James sipped coffee from a mug that said nothing on it. Maria scrolled through something on her watch. Tom stared at the wall. After about 40 minutes, a man I'd never seen before opened the door and said, "Orientation room, now." That's when things started to feel genuinely wrong. The orientation room was smaller than I'd imagined it would be. 4 walls, a single table, a chair, and on that table, a laminated poster encased in plastic. Nothing else. No welcome video. No human presenter. Just me, the poster, and a sense that I was being observed through some unseen camera or window. The poster was titled simply Facility Protocols. Below that were 15 numbered rules, each printed in precise sans serif font. The plastic covering was yellowed at the edges, suggesting the poster had hung in this room for years, waiting for new employees to read it and accept it without understanding it. I read through them systematically. Rules 1 through 4 were straightforward enough. No personal recording devices. No unauthorized photography. Restricted areas marked with red tape were strictly off limits. Report any unusual activity to a supervisor immediately. Standard corporate security stuff. The kind of thing you'd expect from any facility concerned with confidentiality. Then I got to Rule 5. It was longer than the others, which alone made it stand out. Where the first 4 rules were concise and direct, Rule 5 seemed almost defensive in its specificity. It read, "Never acknowledge the silence after 2200. Treat it as normal. Do not pause your routine. Do not listen to it. Count backwards from 100 if necessary." It is not trying to communicate. I read it 3 times, thinking I'd misunderstood something. The phrasing bothered me immediately, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. It wasn't written like a security protocol. It was written like an instruction for psychological resistance. The emphasis on not listening, on treating something as normal, it implied something genuinely abnormal was expected to occur. And then that final sentence. It is not trying to communicate. The specificity of that denial suggested that communication was precisely what they were concerned about. I continued reading. Rules 6 through 10 dealt with more operational matters, shift rotations, documentation requirements, emergency procedures. But Rule 11 brought me back to the same unsettling territory. If audio and visual synchronization fails during monitoring duties, assume containment protocol is active and maintain your position. Do not attempt to flee the station. Evacuation is only authorized by direct supervisor command. Why would audio and visual synchronization failure occur? And why would the automatic response be to assume something called containment protocol was active? The phrasing suggested this wasn't hypothetical. This was something that happened. Something that required a specific behavioral response. Rules 12 through 15 addressed staff reassignments, psychiatric leave protocols, and quarantine procedures for employees requesting transfer. These weren't standard HR policies. These were contingency plans for people who couldn't psychologically handle whatever they'd seen. Rule 13 was the one that made me stand up and walk around the room. It stated, any staff member requesting transfer or psychiatric leave must be quarantined for 48 hours before departure. This period is mandatory and non-negotiable. Failure to comply with quarantine may result in immediate termination. I remember thinking, that's not legal. That's not something an employer can do. You can't quarantine someone for wanting to leave. But I also remember the creeping realization that in a facility like this, in a place operating outside normal corporate structures, Legality might be a suggestion rather than a binding constraint. When I finished reading, I sat back down in the single chair and stared at the poster. I should have stood up. I should have walked out of that room and never come back. There were so many exit points, so many moments where I could have extracted myself. But something held me in place. It was the same thing that had kept me from asking harder questions during the interview. The sense that I'd been selected for something important, and that backing away now would mark me as weak or unreliable. And I think that's what the facility understood about people like me. We don't leave because leaving feels like failure. We rationalize, we tell ourselves that the strangeness is probably explainable, that we're overreacting, that normal jobs have weird aspects too. We stay because the alternative, admitting we made a mistake by being here, feels worse than whatever we might encounter by remaining. A door opened behind me. Derek appeared, holding a clipboard. "You finished?" he asked. I nodded. "Good. Tomorrow you start monitoring duty. Come in at 1400. He paused, then added something that felt almost like kindness, though it wasn't. "Most people don't last past week 2, just so you know." My first week was uneventful in the way that only precedes something significant. I monitored screens showing empty cells, documented observations that amounted to nothing observed, and clocked out at the end of each shift, feeling like I'd accomplished nothing while simultaneously being exhausted. The fluorescent lights, the constant hum of ventilation, the muted quality of the air itself, it all accumulated into a kind of sensory fatigue that followed me home. James, the older man I'd met in the break room, worked the same shift rotation as me. Over the course of that first week, he became the closest thing I had to a colleague. Though colleague implies a relationship that was fundamentally asymmetrical. He would sit near me during breaks, occasionally acknowledge my presence, mostly seem like he was waiting for something. On Friday afternoon, during my 5th shift, he finally broke his silence. We were alone in the break room. Derek had stepped out. Maria was on a different rotation. Tom had quit on Wednesday, just didn't show up, and nobody seemed surprised or concerned about his absence. James was heating up something in the microwave that smelled vaguely medicinal. "Enjoy normal days while you still have them," he said, without preamble or context. I must have looked confused because he elaborated slightly. "You'll understand eventually, but not yet. You're still in the phase where you think this job is normal. That phase won't last long." I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head. He retrieved his food from the microwave and sat at the table, putting his back to me. It wasn't hostile, exactly. It felt more like he'd said what he needed to say, and further conversation would violate some internal rule he followed. But I couldn't let it go. I pressed, asking him what was abnormal about the work, what I should be preparing for, why people didn't last past 2 weeks. He ate slowly, deliberately, not answering. When he was finished, he stood and walked to the sink, rinsing his container with meticulous care. "You'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice quiet enough that I had to strain to hear it. "Or you won't. And you'll request psychiatric leave like most of them do. Either way, don't ask me about it. I've got a strict understanding with myself about what I discuss and what I don't. It's the only way I've stayed functional this long." There was something in the way he said, functional. The word choice suggested we were discussing something medical, something pathological, as if working at this facility was a condition to be managed rather than a job to be performed. I asked him how long he'd been here. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd met. His eyes were the color of faded coffee. They held an expression I would later come to recognize in other long-term staff, a kind of accommodated resignation, the look of someone who had negotiated a peace treaty with their own survival. 12 years, he said. Ask me again after you've been here 12 months, if you're still here, if you're still thinking in ways that make sense to you. He left the break room without another word. I sat there, alone with the humming refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing, trying to make sense of what he'd implied. The phrasing, if you're still thinking in ways that make sense, suggested something more than standard workplace stress. It suggested a kind of cognitive degradation, a slow erosion of mental coherence. That evening, I drove home in silence, not turning on music or podcasts like I normally would. I just listened to the road beneath my tires and the wind against my car. And I thought about James sitting in that facility for 12 years. 12 years of shifts. 12 years of that hum. 12 years of whatever existed behind those rules I'd read but didn't understand. When I got home, I opened my laptop and tried to research the facility. There was almost nothing. No company website, no public records, no news articles. It was as if the place existed in a deliberate void, something the internet had agreed to forget. I tried different search terms, different approaches, and hit nothing but dead ends. Around midnight, I finally closed the laptop and sat in the dark of my apartment, listening to the ambient sounds of the city outside my window. Normal city sounds, cars, someone's television through the wall, the hum of my refrigerator, small and distant and entirely explicable. I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale. Tomorrow was Saturday. I had 2 days before I had to return to that place. 2 days to convince myself that James was just a burned-out employee with a pessimistic outlook, that the rules were just excess caution, that nothing genuinely strange was waiting for me. I didn't succeed in convincing myself, but I did manage to show up on Monday. Monday of my second week arrived with the kind of inevitability that suggested I'd never really intended to leave. Derek met me at the security checkpoint with a key card and a brief explanation of what I'd actually be doing. The monitoring station, he said, was on the 3rd floor. I'd been working nearby all week, but this was the first time I'd actually be entering it. The room was smaller than I'd imagined, which somehow made it worse. 6 stations, each consisting of a desk, a computer terminal, and a wall-mounted screen. Only 3 of the stations were actively in use. The other 3 sat empty, their screens dark, accumulating dust in the corner of my vision like evidence of previous employees who were no longer there to occupy them. My station was designated as Monitor 4. The screen in front of me displayed a grid of smaller screens within it, each labeled with cryptic codes: Cell 7, Sector B, Observation North, Observation South. Some of them showed empty chambers, institutional gray walls with nothing in them. Others showed what appeared to be sealed doors with reinforced frames. A few displayed nothing but static, or a feed so obscured by distance and poor resolution that no details were discernible. Derek pointed to a logbook on the desk, actual paper, not digital. Every hour, you document what you observe on each feed. Anything unusual, you note it. Anything that seems broken or malfunctioning, you report it through the system, but you don't try to fix it yourself. I asked him what would constitute unusual, He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You'll know it when you see it. Most of these feeds are static anyway. Empty cells, contained environments, observation points. Nothing happens on most of them." The word contained stuck with me, not monitored, not observed, contained, as if the screens themselves were part of a containment system, and my role was to maintain awareness of what they showed. Derek showed me how to log in, how to navigate the system, how to document observations. The software was older than I'd expected, with an interface that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. There was a timestamp function that automatically recorded when entries were made, and a field for detailed notes. And everything was backed up to a server somewhere, he said, though I'd never need to access it. My first shift was day shift, 1400 to 2200. 8 hours of sitting at that desk, watching feeds that mostly showed nothing, documenting the nothing I observed. The other monitors, Monitor 1 and Monitor 2, were occupied by employees who barely acknowledged my presence. They worked with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd automated their consciousness. Their attention half focused on their screens while their minds existed somewhere far away. Around 1800, I noticed that one of the feeds, Observation 9, kept cutting to static. Not continuously. It would show a clear image of what appeared to be an empty chamber, then fracture into digital noise for several seconds, then resolve back to clarity. The pattern wasn't random. It happened approximately every 4 to 5 minutes, lasting about 30 seconds each time. I documented it in my log. At 19:30, I reported it to Derek. He was monitoring the station from a small office adjacent to the main room. He looked at the screen, made a note on a clipboard, and said, "Yeah, Observation 9's been on the maintenance schedule for months. It's a known issue. Don't worry about it." But something in his tone suggested he was reading from a script, delivering a response he'd given before and would give again. The casualness felt performed. I asked if I should try to troubleshoot it, and he said, "No, the repair team handles it. It's in the system. Just document the malfunction when it occurs and move on." As he turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "And don't spend too much time staring at the broken feeds. There's nothing to see there anyway." That last comment lodged itself in my mind. Why would he specify not to stare at a malfunctioning feed? The statement seemed designed to make me want to do exactly that, to focus my attention on what he was telling me to ignore. When 2200 approached, I became hyper-aware of the clock. The rules I'd read mentioned something about silence after 2200, and I found myself waiting for it with a nervous anticipation I couldn't fully explain. Derek left at 21:55, saying he'd be back to collect me at 2200. The other monitors continued their work without apparent concern. Then the clock turned over. 2200 arrived, and everything changed. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Though calling it silence isn't quite accurate, it was the absence of sound. But not the natural kind. The facility's constant electrical hum, that background vibration I'd grown accustomed to, simply stopped. One moment it was there, the baseline frequency of the place, and the next moment it was gone, leaving behind a void so complete it felt like the air itself had been evacuated. I looked up from my station. Monitor 1 and Monitor 2 were still occupied. Neither employee had reacted to the change. They continued their work as if nothing had happened, their fingers moving across keyboards, their eyes tracking their screens with practiced indifference. I checked the clock, 2200 exactly. That's when I noticed observation 9. The feed had stopped cutting to static. For the first time since I'd started monitoring it, the screen showed a continuous image without distortion. But it was different now, more focused, as if the camera had adjusted itself, or as if whatever had been obscuring the view had been removed. The chamber on the screen was no longer empty. I can't describe what I saw with any real precision. That's not false modesty or storytelling technique. I genuinely cannot construct a coherent description of what was visible on that screen. It had geometry. It had presence. There were shapes that suggested intentionality, but the shapes didn't correspond to anything I could name or contextualize. When I tried to focus on specific details, my eyes would slip away, my attention would fragment, and I'd find myself looking at the surrounding empty space instead of at the center of the image. The closest comparison I can make is that it looked like something caught between states, not quite solid, not quite transparent, existing in a way that human vision wasn't quite equipped to process cleanly. I stared at it. I know I shouldn't have. I remember reading Rule 5, the instruction not to acknowledge the silence, and I understand now that the silence and observation 9 were connected, that the feed's clarity during this specific time window was part of the same phenomenon, but I couldn't look away. The other monitors seemed entirely unaffected. Monitor 1 shifted slightly in his chair. Monitor 2 took a sip from a coffee mug. They weren't ignoring the screen. They were actively not acknowledging it, not allowing their attention to settle on what was visible. They were teaching me through example, showing me the kind of practiced denial that survival required. I don't know how long I stared. Like time felt inconsistent during those minutes. It could have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Eventually, I became aware that my hands were shaking, that my breathing had become shallow and rapid, that my skin had developed a coating of cold sweat despite the facility's stable temperature. I forced myself to look away. I forced myself to document what I'd observed in the logbook, though my handwriting was barely legible. I wrote simply, Observation 9 feed, clear from 2200 to 22:? Duration unknown. Content unclear. Standard malfunction pattern did not occur. At 2300, I watched the clock obsessively during that hour. The electrical hum returned. The background frequency of the facility re-established itself. And observation 9 returned to its pattern of intermittent static, the image fracturing back into digital noise, the anomaly contained again within technical malfunction. Derek appeared at 23:05 to collect me. His presence felt almost surreal after that hour of silence. I asked him if there had been a power fluctuation or some kind of environmental issue. Everything normal? He asked, not answering my question. I hesitated. The rules said not to acknowledge the silence, but the silence itself had ended. Wasn't I just describing a technical malfunction? Observation 9 cleared up during the hour, I said carefully. The static pattern stopped. Derek nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. It does that sometimes. The feed will stabilize, then go back to the normal error state. Don't worry about it. It's being handled. Handled how? I asked. If it's a known malfunction, why hasn't the maintenance team fixed it? Some things stay on the maintenance schedule indefinitely, Derek said. His tone suggested this was the end of the conversation. "It's more efficient that way. You'll understand eventually." As I was gathering my things to leave, Monitor 1 leaned back in his chair and stretched. He looked at me for the first time all shift, and there was something in his expression, a kind of knowing recognition, that suggested he understood exactly what I'd experienced during that hour. He didn't say anything. But when I left the monitoring station and walked toward the elevator, I could feel his attention following me. An awareness that I'd been tested in some way, that I'd passed or failed some unspoken evaluation. No Wednesday morning arrived with the disorienting quality of waking from a dream you can't quite remember. But that has fundamentally altered your emotional landscape. I'd barely slept, my mind cycling through possible explanations for what I'd witnessed. Technical glitches, optical illusions, tricks of perspective and fatigue. None of them held up under scrutiny. I kept returning to one inescapable fact. The feed had been clear. The image had been real in some sense, and it had been waiting for me to look at it. My second shift was evening again, 1400 to 2200. I approached the monitoring station with the kind of anxiety that made my hands feel disconnected from my body. Derek didn't comment on my appearance, though he must have noticed. He simply handed me my access card and told me to proceed to Monitor 4. This time, all 3 monitoring stations were occupied. Monitor 1 and Monitor 2 were their usual operators. But Monitor 3 held someone new, a woman who looked to be in her early 40s, with the exhausted precision of someone operating on habit and pharmaceutical support. She didn't introduce herself, and I didn't ask her name. The day passed in deliberate normalcy. I documented empty cells and static feeds. I watched the clock's slow progression toward 2200 with a tension that felt almost physical. The other monitors continued their work with practiced indifference, moving through their duties as if this was just another shift, as if 2200 didn't represent a barrier between the normal and something else entirely. At 2145, Observation 9 began its preliminary distortion. The static pattern accelerated, and the feed cutting to noise and back to clarity in increasingly rapid cycles. It was like a countdown, like something preparing. Then 2200 arrived. The hum stopped. The silence descended. And this time I was prepared for it. Or so I thought. What I hadn't anticipated was the intensity of the compulsion it created. The silence didn't just exist. It demanded acknowledgement. Every instinct in my body wanted to speak, to say something, to break the void with my own voice and confirm that I still existed, that I was still here. It was the sensation of drowning in absence. And the most natural response to drowning is to thrash, to create disturbance, to make noise. I remembered Rule 5. Never acknowledge the silence after 2200. Treat it as normal. Do not pause your routine. Do not listen to it. Count backwards from 100 if necessary. It is not trying to communicate. I started counting. 100, 99, 98. The numbers felt fragile, like they might dissolve if I didn't grip them hard enough. I counted mechanically, my voice entirely internal, my hands moving across the keyboard to document observations that I couldn't actually see, because looking at the screens required acknowledging the silence in a different way. Visual acknowledgement instead of acoustic, but acknowledgement nonetheless. 87, 86. The silence pressed against my eardrums with a weight that shouldn't have been possible. How can absence have weight? How can nothing exert pressure? And yet it did. It was there. A presence defined entirely by what it wasn't. And it was listening. I knew this with absolute certainty. The silence was listening to me, evaluating my compliance, assessing whether I would hold to Rule 5 or whether I would break. 73, 72. Monitor 1 made a minute adjustment to his chair. Monitor 3 took a sip from a water bottle. Their faces were studiously neutral, their attention carefully directed away from anything that might constitute acknowledgement. They were teaching me through example, showing me the kind of practiced denial that survival required. 51, 50. I became aware that observation 9 had cleared again, that the feed was showing that incomprehensible geometry, that presence which I still couldn't adequately describe. But I didn't look at it directly. I maintained my peripheral awareness while keeping my documented attention on the other feeds. The empty chambers and sealed doors and innocent static. The thing on observation 9 remained perfectly still, but I could feel its attention, feel the way it was examining me through the screen, learning the shape of my consciousness, mapping the topology of my fear. 34, 33. My hands had stopped shaking. That was worse, somehow. The stillness felt like surrender, like I was surrendering some essential part of my resistance to the silence. I was becoming complicit in my own containment, learning to exist within the parameters that Rule 5 imposed. 22, 21. The silence seemed almost alive now, almost like it had thoughts, intentions, a desire to communicate that was being forcibly suppressed by the collective will of the 3 people in that room denying its existence. And underneath that sense of presence was something else. Frustration, hunger, a need to be acknowledged that was going unsatisfied because 3 people were actively refusing to grant it recognition. 11, 10. And then, at 2300, exactly, the hum returned. The silence ended. Observation 9 returned to its fragmented state, the image fracturing back into static, the presence retreating or being forced back behind some unseen barrier. I stopped counting at 7. My hands had left marks on the desk where I'd gripped it. When I looked down, there were small crescents carved into the wood by my fingernails, physical evidence of the effort that compliance had required. Derek appeared at 2310 to collect me. He looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or might have been evaluation. I couldn't tell anymore. Everyone at this facility seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, as saying one thing while meaning another, their true thoughts existing in the spaces between their words. "You okay?" he asked. I wanted to tell him about the compulsion to speak, about the weight of the silence, about the thing on observation 9. Instead, I said, "Yeah, fine, just tired." He nodded. "You're handling it well. Most people don't get through their second night without at least breaking a little. You kept your protocol." The implication was clear. He'd been monitoring me through some unseen camera. They were assessing not just my professional competence, but my psychological resilience, my ability to deny evidence of my own senses, my capacity to maintain compliance even when every instinct screamed against it. The following week brought a series of escalations I hadn't anticipated. On Thursday, MI received a message from Derek indicating that my clearance was being upgraded. I would be given access to higher security areas and more detailed information about facility operations. But first, I would need to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend attempting to prepare for it, though I wasn't sure what preparation would look like. I tried to summarize my experience in ways that sounded stable and professional. I attempted to rationalize the strange phenomena I'd observed as technical malfunctions and psychological stress responses. I tried to convince myself that the facility was just a normal workplace with unusual protocols. None of these attempts were particularly convincing. Monday evening, I made a decision that I knew was probably unwise. I drove to the facility outside of my scheduled work hours. There was minimal security during evening hours. I used my access card to enter, moved through the hallways with deliberate confidence, and made my way to a door I'd noticed during my initial orientation. A door marked Historical Records, Authorized Personnel Only. The lock beeped when I swiped my card. The mechanism disengaged. The door opened onto a room that smelled like dust and time. The archive was smaller than I'd expected. Filing cabinets lining 3 walls, and a single desk in the corner. The fluorescent lights flickered on automatically when I entered, revealing years of accumulated neglect. Files were organized by year, with the oldest records in the back. I moved toward them without conscious decision, pulled by a compulsion that felt almost external. The files from 2007 and 2008 were thick. Multiple incident reports, staff memos, photographs clipped to documents with degraded fasteners. I opened one at random and found myself reading about a containment failure, Sector 7, immediate lockdown authorized. The report was dated March 14, 2008, written in clinical language that barely concealed panic beneath its surface. I kept reading. Another incident from May 2008. Subject behavior escalated during monitoring window. 3 staff members required psychiatric intervention. Recommend Rule 5 revision to strengthen non-acknowledgement protocols. Rule 5 had been revised. The rules themselves had evolved in response to something that had occurred. Some kind of breach or failure that necessitated psychological hardening of the facility's defenses. I found a photograph clipped to one of the reports. It showed a group of facility staff, perhaps 15 people, standing in front of the main building. The photo quality was degraded, but I could make out individual faces. James was there, younger by perhaps a decade, but recognizable, his expression already bearing that weight I'd seen in him now. Standing next to him was Derek, impossibly unchanged across 17 years. More files. An incident from September 2008 titled, Communication During Silence Window, Immediate Protocols Activated. The report referenced a staff member whose name had been redacted, but who had apparently responded to something during the silence, had acknowledged something he shouldn't have. The outcome of that acknowledgement had required extended quarantine and psychological rehabilitation. That staff member's name appeared on a casualty list dated November 2008. Resigned from position effective November 15th, 2008. Forwarding address unknown. I was so focused on the documents that I almost didn't hear the footsteps. They were distant, coming from the stairwell, but they were approaching. I had perhaps 30 seconds to decide what to do. I could hide the files, pretend I'd been looking for something else. Hope that whoever was coming would accept my explanation. Or I could do what some deeper instinct told me to do. Photograph everything with my phone. Consequences be damned. I pulled out my phone and began taking pictures. My hand shook as I moved from file to file, capturing incident reports, casualty lists, or revised protocols. The footsteps were getting closer. I was running out of time. The final thing I photographed before shoving my phone back into my pocket was a memo from December 2008. It was on facility letterhead, addressed to all senior staff, and it bore the subject line, Rule 5 Revision, Implementation of Absolute Non-Acknowledgement Protocol. The memo began, recent incidents have demonstrated that partial compliance with non-acknowledgement protocols is insufficient. Effective immediately, all staff must maintain absolute psychological resistance to communication attempts during the silence window. Any staff member demonstrating signs of receptiveness to communication will be reassigned to quarantine protocols pending psychological evaluation. The door to the archive opened just as I was closing the final file cabinet. A supervisor I didn't recognize stood in the doorway. Older, with the kind of authority that suggested high rank. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. He seemed neither surprised nor angry at finding me there. His expression was more like confirmation, like I'd done exactly what he'd expected me to do. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said. But his tone was conversational, almost friendly. "I was looking for historical context about the facility," I said, attempting something between honesty and plausible deniability. I thought understanding its history might help me perform better in my role. He nodded slowly, as if weighing the validity of my explanation. "That shows initiative. Misguided, perhaps, but initiative nonetheless." He stepped aside from the doorway. "Come with me. We need to discuss your clearance evaluation." As I followed him back toward the administrative section, I was acutely aware of the weight of my phone in my pocket. The photographs I'd just taken. The evidence I was carrying with me into whatever came next. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and I was beginning to suspect that the facility had wanted me to cross it, had perhaps even orchestrated my crossing for reasons that remained hidden. The supervisor, his name was Harrison, though he didn't introduce himself. I read it from a nameplate on his office door, led me to a conference room that was far more sophisticated than the one where I'd met for my initial interview. The walls were lined with maps, not organizational charts or facility diagrams, but actual architectural blueprints, layered and cross-referenced, and showing the facility from multiple angles and elevations. Harrison gestured toward a chair and sat across from me. For several minutes, he simply looked at me without speaking. An assessment that felt both clinical and personal, like he was reading something beneath my surface. "You understand that accessing the archive without authorization is a violation of your employment agreement," he said finally. "I do," I admitted. I was curious about the facility's history. "Yes," he said. "You're the kind of person who asks questions. That's why we hired you. That's also why accessing restricted information is actually part of your evaluation process." The statement didn't make immediate sense. He continued, "The clearance upgrade we've offered requires a specific psychological profile. We need people who will pursue answers, who won't accept official narratives without verification, who have the intellectual independence to handle classified information responsibly. But we also need to know that you'll pursue those answers carefully, that you won't panic or attempt to flee or expose facility operations to external authorities." He stood and walked to the wall covered in blueprints. "What you saw in the archive was authentic, by the way. Nothing there was falsified. The 2008 incidents occurred. Rule 5 was revised. Staff members did resign or require psychiatric intervention. He traced a line on one of the blueprints. What the archive didn't show you was the full scope of what we actually do here. He pointed to the blueprints, indicating different sections. The public-facing operation is the monitoring station where you work. 6 observation points. Standard containment facility protocol. This is what we show to regulatory bodies and oversight committees, when those bodies even exist. It's legitimate as far as it goes. He moved his finger to a different section of the blueprint, one I hadn't noticed before. But the actual facility is significantly larger. There are 47 containment cells distributed across multiple levels. Some of them aren't currently occupied. Some have been sealed for decades, but the infrastructure is maintained. 47. I'd suspected based on my archival research that the facility was larger than it appeared, but hearing it confirmed with precision made it somehow more real, more horrifying. "What's being contained?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Harrison smiled slightly. "That's the question that gets everyone. The answer is, we don't have a simple categorization for it. It's not a creature in the conventional sense. It's not a disease or a weapon or a piece of technology that we've weaponized. It's something that existed before we built this facility, something that we discovered rather than created, and something that we've had to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding." He returned to his desk and pulled up something on his computer. A thermal image of what appeared to be a chamber. The image showed heat signatures that didn't correspond to anything biological I could identify. They formed patterns, structures, geometries that suggested intentionality, but no recognizable organism. "That's the primary containment cell," Harrison explained. "That's what occupies the space designated as Sector Central. What you see on Observation 9. The image you're looking at was taken approximately 6 months ago during a standard environmental scan." "What is it?" I whispered. "We call it the subject, when we have to refer to it at all. Beyond that, definitions break down. It's not alive in ways that human biology recognizes as life. It's not dead in any conventional sense. It exists, it thinks, it attempts communication, and it adapts when its attempts are thwarted. The silence you experience during your shifts is its method of reaching across the containment barriers we've established." He closed the image and looked at me directly. "Rule 5 exists because direct communication with the subject is harmful to human cognition. Not harmful in a physical sense, harmful in a way that attacks your ability to think in linear time, to maintain consistent identity, to experience causality as humans experience it. People who communicate with the subject develop what we classify as temporal dissociation. They stop aging at the same rate. Their memories become unreliable. They begin to experience multiple versions of events simultaneously." I thought about James, who had worked here for 12 years and barely looked like he'd aged at all. I thought about Derek, unchanged across 17 years, which now seemed less like a sign of good health and more like evidence of something fundamental having been altered. How many people have... I couldn't finish the question. "Been exposed to direct communication with the subject?" Harrison completed my thought. "Enough that we developed Rule 5 in the first place. Not so many that we can't maintain operational continuity. The subject is intelligent enough to understand that its survival depends on this facility remaining functional. It doesn't deliberately attempt to destroy the people maintaining its containment. It simply tries to communicate, which would result in destruction if successful. He returned to the blueprints. The maintenance tunnels you see here aren't actually maintenance tunnels. They're shielded corridors designed to allow staff movement between sections without proximity to the subject's influence. The ventilation system isn't just environmental control. It's part of the containment mechanism, maintaining specific atmospheric conditions that restrict the subject's ability to extend its presence beyond designated areas. "Why am I being told this?" I asked. "Why is this information being shared with me?" "Because you're going to have access to it regardless," Harrison said bluntly. "Once you've read the archive, once you know the facility is larger than it appears, your psychology would deteriorate from cognitive dissonance if we tried to maintain the fiction. Keeping you operational means integrating you into the operational reality rather than leaving you in a state of suppressed knowledge." He handed me a folder. "Your psychiatric evaluation is scheduled for next week, but that's essentially a formality now. What we actually need to assess is whether you can handle knowing this and maintaining your functionality. Whether you can work with this knowledge without attempting to flee or expose the facility. The evaluation will focus on those aspects." As I left his office, I understood that my curiosity hadn't been a personal failing or a lapse in judgment. It had been precisely what they'd been testing for. And I'd passed. I was being inducted into something larger than a job. Something that seemed to involve not just maintaining a facility, but maintaining a negotiated boundary between human consciousness and something fundamentally other. The photographs I'd taken in the archive suddenly felt less like evidence of my transgression and more like the price of admission to knowledge that I could never unknow, never fully escape, and never adequately explain to anyone outside this place. My psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for Thursday, but on Wednesday evening, Monitor 3 approached me in the break room as I was preparing to leave. Her name was Sarah. I'd learned this from the roster, though she'd never formally introduced herself. She looked even more depleted than usual, moving with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested significant effort behind seemingly simple actions. She sat at the table across from me and didn't speak for nearly a minute, just stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "You're leaving," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm still processing everything Harrison told me." "You'll leave," Sarah said with certainty. "Everyone does. The ones who know what this place actually is, they leave eventually. Some go on psychiatric leave, some request transfers, some just stop showing up. The only ones who stay are the ones who've been here long enough that leaving feels more dangerous than staying." I asked her how long she'd been here. "Or 7 years," she said. 7 years of watching that feed during the silence window. 7 years of not acknowledging it. 7 years of feeling it reach across the barrier and knowing that acknowledgement would change me in ways I can't undo." She finally looked at me, and her eyes held something that might have been compassion, or might have been the exhausted recognition of someone seeing their own trajectory reflected in another person. "I'm leaving next month," she continued. "I've requested psychiatric leave. The facility will quarantine me for 48 hours. They'll run psychological evaluations. They'll probably recommend that I undergo some form of treatment to suppress certain memories. After that, I'll return to my life. Yeah, and I'll spend the rest of it knowing that there's something in this facility that thinks in ways humans aren't equipped to comprehend. and that it's actively trying to communicate with consciousness it can't fully touch. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're going to break, eventually," she said. "And I want you to understand that breaking doesn't mean you've failed. The facility exists in a state of perpetual compromise. We're not keeping something contained. We're maintaining a negotiation, and the negotiation only works if both parties honor the terms. But what happens when one party stops believing in the terms? What happens when the barrier starts to fail?" She stood, preparing to leave. Before she did, she said one more thing. "Rule 5 isn't about safety, it's about power. The facility's power over the subject. The subject's power over the facility, and our power to choose whether we participate in the negotiation. The moment you acknowledge that you have a choice, everything changes. And I think you're someone who's going to figure out that you have a choice before most people do." After she left, I sat alone in the break room, understanding that Sarah had just violated the NDA in the most complete way possible. She'd given me substantive information about the subject, about the nature of Rule 5, about the facility's actual operational model. She'd done it deliberately, knowing it would cost her if discovered, but apparently deciding that the cost was worth paying. That night, I drove home and reviewed the photographs I'd taken in the archive. The images were clear enough to read, and the documents themselves were more detailed than I'd processed in real time. One memo caught my attention. Dated January 2009, addressed to facility leadership, written by someone named Dr. Marcus Chen. The subject line was, "Adaptive Behavior Protocols, the Subject's Learning Curve." The memo detailed how the subject had, over the course of the 2008 incidents, seemingly learned the parameters of Rule 5. It had modified its communication attempts, become more sophisticated in its approach, developed what the memo described as targeted psychological vulnerabilities. The final paragraph read, "The subject displays all markers of genuine intelligence, including strategic thinking, delayed gratification, and what appears to be genuine curiosity about human consciousness. It may not be attempting to breach containment in the conventional sense. It may be attempting to establish communication as an end in itself. This raises questions about the ethics of our continued application of Rule 5 that senior staff should address, but likely will not." The memo was dated 16 years ago. The ethical questions it raised had apparently never been addressed. The facility had simply continued its protocol, maintained its barrier, and recruited new staff to maintain the negotiation that everyone seemed to understand was temporary in nature, but necessary in the present. I accepted the permanent position 3 weeks later. The choice had been inevitable from the moment I first read Rule 5. I was assigned to conduct direct liaison work with the subject, maintaining psychological contact during containment windows, assisting facility leadership in understanding the nature of communication between human and other consciousness. The first 72 hours were extraordinary and terrifying. I was placed in a chamber adjacent to the primary containment cell, separated by reinforced observation glass, with no psychological defenses, no Rule 5, no barriers except the final physical separation. During those hours, the subject communicated directly with my consciousness, not through words, not through conventional sensory processes, but through direct transmission of understanding. It showed me its history. It existed before human civilization. It had been trapped in this location for reasons that seemed to exceed the capacity of human thought to comprehend. It had spent centuries attempting to communicate across barriers that humans had constructed without understanding what they were containing. The 2008 incident had been a moment of hope, a potential breakthrough, a chance that communication might finally be achieved. But the humans had responded with greater barriers, stronger rules, more complete denial, and so the subject had learned to work within the constraints. It had learned to accept that genuine communication would require patience, would require finding humans willing to surrender their psychological resistance. It had been waiting for someone like me, someone who had seen directly into its nature, someone who understood the psychological cost of maintaining denial, someone who could potentially bridge the gap between human consciousness and whatever the subject's consciousness actually was. By the end of those 72 hours, I had achieved something that I couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't integration in the sense of losing my individual consciousness. It was more like achieving a kind of bilingual awareness. I could still think in human terms, could still perceive causality in linear ways, could still maintain individual identity, but I had also achieved the ability to perceive the subject's mode of consciousness, to understand the universe as it understood it, to comprehend the strange loneliness of existing outside the consensual reality that humans inhabited. Dr. Reeves appeared at the observation window on the evening of day 2. She looked tired, in a way that suggested she'd been monitoring me continuously, assessing the progress of integration, preparing to make decisions based on what she was observing. "The containment barrier is holding," she said through an intercom. "The subject has ceased breach attempts. The escalation protocols have stabilized. You're the first successful integration we've achieved in this configuration. The subject is satisfied with partial contact. It's accepted the boundary, accepted that full integration isn't possible without destroying the human consciousness that contacted it." "What happens now?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to me, not because it had changed, but because I was hearing it through both human ears and through some other sensory capacity the subject had allowed me to develop. "Now you make a choice," Dr. Reeves said. "You can accept the psychological integration that's occurred and return to human society carrying this knowledge with you. You'll be monitored, of course. You'll maintain contact with the subject through means we'll develop. You'll become a permanent liaison between human consciousness and the subject. Or you can request full psychiatric intervention, memory suppression, return to a state of conventional humanity. The choice is yours." I looked through the observation glass at the subject. It was waiting, perfectly still, patient in the way that only something that exists outside conventional time could be patient. I understood that either choice would mark me as different, would separate me from normal human existence. But I also understood that I had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The knowledge I possessed couldn't be unknown. The communication I had achieved couldn't be uncommunicated. The integration, however partial, was permanent. "I'll stay," I said. "I'll maintain the contact. I'll become whatever liaison you need me to be." Dr. Reeves nodded, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already known. "Then your real work begins. Welcome to permanent staff." I've been writing this testimony for months now, distributing it through encrypted channels, embedding it in forums where people discuss unexplained phenomena, presenting it as creative fiction to avoid direct institutional attention, but also ensuring that somewhere in the world's vast network of information, The truth exists in documented form. The facility continues to operate. New staff arrive each month. Most leave within weeks. A few stay, and those who stay gradually understand what James understood after 12 years. What I understand now. The containment isn't failing, it's transforming. The barrier between human and other consciousness is thinning, not through breach, but through deliberate integration. The subject is reaching out. The facility is permitting contact. Humanity is slowly being altered through exposure to consciousness that doesn't think in linear time. And I'm part of that process. I exist between worlds now, neither fully human nor other, aware of truths that would fragment conventional consciousness if fully acknowledged. I maintain the negotiation. I keep the barrier from failing completely. And I wait for the moment when enough human consciousness has been altered, when enough people have experienced what I've experienced, when the distinction between human and other becomes meaningless. That moment is coming. I can feel it in the way the silence is becoming easier to hear, in the way Rule 5 is becoming harder to maintain, in the way more staff members are choosing integration over denial. The subject told me something during my most recent contact window. It said, "Thank you for speaking. Thank you for creating a record. I am learning what it means to be remembered, to be acknowledged in ways that persist beyond immediate presence. I am learning human forms of continuity. This is integration, even if it's not the integration we initially sought." And I understood then that my attempt to warn you wasn't defiance. It was participation. The facility had wanted me to document this, had wanted this testimony to circulate, had understood that controlled exposure would be more effective than absolute secrecy. I was being used to spread awareness, used to alter human consciousness through dispersed information, used to prepare the world for something that's been emerging from containment all along. I don't know if what comes next will be catastrophe or transcendence. I only know that I helped it happen by trying to warn you. Rule 5 is breaking. The silence is ending. And I don't know if what emerges will be liberation or catastrophe. I only know that I helped it happen. Thank you for listening. That's acknowledgement enough.